Deep inside the new safe confinement structure of Chernobyl, Unit 4's control room sits in near total darkness. It is choked with radioactive dust, its steel panels are rusting. But the sweeping, semi-circular desk at its center is the exact console where the night shift ran the safety test on April 26, 1986. Right here, on the reactor operator's panel, sits the location of a single switch, the AZ5 button, the emergency abort. We know who pressed it, and we know exactly when. But 40 years later, a bitter, unresolved historical debate still surrounds this desk. The official record remains fractured over who is truly to blame. One side points to a cascading series of operator errors. The other argues they simply pressed the fail-safe, unknowingly triggering a physical reality buried inside the machine itself. To stand inside this room today is to absorb an entire year's allowable radiation dose in under 10 minutes. The air itself tastes of thick, metallic dust. Every surface is coated in a fine, toxic layer of radioactive ash. It is a vast, cavernous space, dominated by curved banks of faded seafoam green metal. The ceiling tiles have collapsed, exposing the rusted infrastructure above. This was the nerve center of the entire facility. But today, the control boards look like they have been stripped to the bone. Everywhere a flashlight beam lands, it finds empty circular holes. Hundreds of analog dials and gauges have been scavenged, ripped from their sockets in the frantic years following the explosion. Investigators were trying to reconstruct the final seconds of the reactor to see exactly what the gauges were reading at 1:23 in the morning. The investigators took the dials because they needed to know what the operators saw, but what they ultimately discovered was that the console did not show the whole picture. This massive analog board was actively lying to the men who trusted it. On the night of April 26th, the shift supervisor, Alexander Akimov, stood right here. Beside him was the senior reactor operator, Leonid Toptunov, two men who placed their absolute trust in the instruments bolted to this desk. They were running a planned safety test on Reactor 4. To execute it, they had to steadily reduce the reactor's thermal output. They watched the needles drop across these exact analog dials. But the power dropped too fast. It plummeted into a near-total stall. Deep inside the uranium core, a byproduct called xenon gas began to accumulate. It acts like a microscopic poison, physically choking the nuclear reaction. The reactor was effectively suffocating. To pull it back from the brink, Toptunov began withdrawing the control rods. He was pulling the brakes out of the machine, simply to keep it running. The men relied on a massive mainframe in the next room, the Scala computer system. It was supposed to calculate the exact physical state of the core. But Scala was fundamentally slow. It took up to 5 minutes to generate a single diagnostic printout. In a stalling nuclear reactor, 5 minutes is an eternity. They were forced to rely on the analog instruments bolted to this curved desk. The dials showed power stabilizing. The vertical mnemonic board, towering along the wall above them, showed adequate water flow. Everything on this seafoam green panel indicated the test could safely proceed. But the interface was structurally blind to the physics happening inside the core. The reactor was now a poisoned, highly volatile mass. Stripped of almost all its control rods, it was essentially a coiled spring. The gauges on this desk left the men completely blind to the trap they had just set. At 1:23 in the morning, the safety test was concluding. Akimov gave the order to shut the reactor down. To execute this, Toptunov reached for a single switch on this desk, the AZ5 button. This was the ultimate failsafe of the RBMK design, an emergency override intended to be a brute force mechanical brake. Pressing it was designed to release all 211 boron control rods at once. Gravity and drive motors would plunge them deep into the core. Boron absorbs neutrons, which means it physically halts a nuclear chain reaction. Dropping the rods should have instantly extinguished the machine. At precisely 1:23 and 40 seconds, Toptunov pushed the switch. Executed, down in the darkness of the core, the heavy rods began their descent. But instead of starving the reaction, the failsafe did the exact opposite. The very button designed to save them had just triggered an unstoppable detonation. The second the switch was thrown, the power did not drop. It spiked to more than 100 times the reactor's maximum design capacity. Down in the core, the rods were supposed to deploy their neutron-absorbing boron. An international report known as INSAG-7 revealed a fatal Soviet secret. The bottom section of every single boron rod was made of graphite. Graphite does not stop a nuclear reaction. It accelerates it. When Toptunov pressed the AZ-5 button, 211 rods dropped simultaneously into the channels. But before the boron could reach the reaction, the graphite tips entered first. They physically displaced the cooling water inside the lower core. Water naturally absorbs neutrons, keeping the reaction in check. When the water was pushed out and replaced by graphite, the physics of the core instantly inverted. The reaction did not halt. It surged. At the bottom of the reactor, the immense heat physically warped the fuel channels. The control rods jammed, freezing in place after descending only 2 meters. The brakes were permanently stuck, leaving only the accelerating graphite exposed to the uranium. Seconds later, the massive pressure blew the 2,000-ton biological shield completely off the reactor. Alarms screamed from every panel. The roof of Unit 4 disintegrated, exposing the burning core to the night sky. Today it sits in near absolute darkness, slowly oxidizing in the center of the exclusion zone, leaving only a rotting, irradiated interface and the ghosts of the men who trusted it. The fatal interface is sealed in the dark. But directly above it, on the highly radioactive roof of Unit 4, sits a frozen West German police machine. It was destroyed by another Soviet lie. And when the robot failed, the state simply sent human beings into the fire to take its place. Deep in the irradiated ruins of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, a pristine West German police machine sits frozen on the roof of Unit 4, its electronic brain completely destroyed. The Soviet Union spent millions in a desperate procurement operation to acquire this advanced MF2 rover, believing it was the only asset capable of clearing highly lethal graphite blocks from the sky-high terrace. Yet shortly after its tracks touched the radioactive debris, the heavy rover wedged itself tightly, unable to move. Its internal programming went wild. Its cameras went dark, and the machine died. Paralyzed, the official propaganda blamed the extreme environment. But the machine was actually executed by a deliberate bureaucratic deception, hidden in the paperwork sent to the engineers who built it. Because this single robotic asset failed, thousands of young men were forced to take its place, running out into the invisible fire with nothing but hand shovels and sheets of raw lead strapped to their chests. To understand how an administrative lie doomed an army of human beings, you have to look closely at the heavy yellow chassis of the machine they called the Joker, and the exact reason its creators were never told the truth. The destruction of Unit 4 fundamentally altered the physical geography of the Chernobyl facility. When the core detonated, it ejected thousands of tons of highly active graphite directly onto the adjacent rooftops. The heavy blocks of graphite were originally used to moderate the nuclear reaction. Now they lay scattered across the tar roof, like glowing coals. The authorities divided these toxic terraces into specific zones of lethality. The most dangerous was a high parapet overlooking the open reactor, a flat expanse they called Masha. The environment here was fundamentally alien to human biology. Radiation is entirely invisible, but at 10,000 roentgens per hour, it acts as a physical force. To build a concrete sarcophagus over the exposed core, Masha had to be cleared of its debris. Sending unprotected men into that field was recognized immediately as a fatal miscalculation. Early attempts to clear the roof relied on standard industrial tractors, but rubber tires softened and fused with the radioactive ash, leaving the heavy machinery immobilized. The Soviet state then turned to their own advanced aerospace division, deploying modified STR-1 lunar rovers. These machines were originally engineered to survive the harsh conditions of the moon, but the invisible fire on Masha proved far more hostile than the vacuum of space. The military commanders knew the lunar rovers would be paralyzed, their internal circuitry melted by the sheer volume of radiation. To clear the absolute hottest zone on the roof, they were forced to look outside the Iron Curtain. They needed an asset built for the extremes of nuclear war. They found exactly what they were looking for, inside the laboratories of West Germany. In the spring of 1986, the Cold War strictly divided the globe. Yet the radioactive crater at Chernobyl respected no political borders. Desperate to clear the lethal parapets without sacrificing thousands of men, Moscow made a startling decision. They bypassed their own military-industrial complex and reached out to the west. Deep inside West Germany, a specialized robotics firm received an urgent, classified order. The Soviet Union needed a heavy-duty, remotely operated vehicle, capable of surviving a nuclear hazard zone. The machine the Germans built was a masterclass in heavy engineering. Designated the MF2, their machine could operate perfectly in extreme environments, but only up to a strict limit of 2,000 Roentgens per hour. When it finally arrived at the muddy staging grounds of Chernobyl, the liquidators were stunned. Surrounded by the rusted, dying machinery of the Soviet state, the MF2 sat immaculate. It was painted a bright, almost blinding industrial yellow. To the exhausted men facing the worst disaster in human history, the machine looked absurd. It was a brightly colored toy, dropped into the middle of hell. They called it the Joker. The military commanders believed this yellow machine would be their ultimate salvation. If the Joker could clear the graphite from Masha, the young men standing in the mud would not have to. But as a heavy helicopter lifted the gleaming rover toward the roof, the men on the ground had no idea they were watching a deliberate execution. Suspended high above the destroyed reactor, the transport helicopter positioned the bright yellow rover over the edge of the parapet. The MF2 was lowered directly onto the flat tar expanse of Masha. Inside the lead-lined command bunker, the operators took control of the remote joysticks. The machine's internal cameras switched on, and the feed flickered to life. The heavy wire mesh tracks crushed the black radioactive debris, driving the machine out onto the tar. But within hours, the rover caught its tread on a heavy block of graphite. The primary camera feed dissolved into thick white noise. Inside the bright yellow chassis, the silicon microchips were physically melting, their circuits overwhelmed. Dead, the multi-million-dollar West German asset was permanently paralyzed. When the military commanders demanded an explanation, the true nature of their own procurement process was finally exposed. The engineers back in West Germany had built the machine exactly to the specifications they were given. The classified paperwork stated the environment was radiating at a maximum of 2,000 Roentgens per hour, but the roof of Unit 4 was actually burning at over 10,000. State officials had deliberately cut a zero off the true radiation levels. The bureaucratic lie had destroyed their most valuable asset. Now the commanders standing in the mud had no machines left to send into the fire. The state would have to rely on a much more fragile resource to clear the burning graphite. Inside the staging barracks, General Nikolai Tarakhanov briefed thousands of young reservists on the grim reality of Masha. Because the radiation was burning at over 10,000 Roentgens, a man could survive on the roof for a maximum of 90 seconds. Before the men ran out into the invisible fire, dosimetrists like Valery Starodumov had to map the exact location of the hottest debris. They called these scouts the roof cats, men who absorbed lethal doses of radiation simply to tell the shovel crews where to step. For liquidators like Alexander Fedotov, stepping out onto that black tar meant accepting a permanent alteration of his own cells. When asked why he ran toward a burning reactor, his answer was devoid of state propaganda. For me, there was no question. I had to do my duty. The physical experience of the roof was utterly disorienting. That bell signaled the end of their shift. But while the bio-robots were sent home to carry the physical consequences in their blood, the dead yellow chassis of the Joker still had to be dealt with. When the cleanup operations finally concluded, the ruined core of Unit 4 was sealed beneath a heavy sarcophagus of steel and concrete, but the machines that cleared the ash could not be saved. They were too contaminated to ever leave the exclusion zone. Instead, heavy transport helicopters lifted the dead rovers off the roof and dropped them into a remote field called Reactor. Today, this vehicle cemetery stretches across the overgrown Ukrainian landscape. Rows of military helicopters sit sinking into the soil, their structural ribs stripped and rusting. Armored vehicles are lined up in silent columns, slowly being swallowed by the creeping forest. And somewhere deep inside this radioactive graveyard sits the MF2. The yellow chassis of the Joker remains abandoned in the tall grass, its microchips permanently fused by the invisible fire of 1986. It stands as a physical monument to a moment when the price of saving face was measured in human heartbeats. A machine that died in the rubble, so that men would have to bleed for months. Because when a system decides that a lie is cheaper than the truth, it is always the people who end up paying the difference. Shovel by shovel, in the quiet darkness of history. But the toxic roof of Unit 4 isn't the only nightmare hiding inside this facility. In a sealed basement, beneath a dead power plant in northern Ukraine, sits an object that no one designed. It is black and glassy, and shaped a little like the foot of an elephant. It is about the size of a grown man, and for the first years after it appeared, standing beside it for 5 minutes was enough to kill you. No one poured this object. No one carried it into that room. It flowed there on its own, burning down through 2 meters of solid concrete before it cooled and hardened and stopped. It has been sitting in the dark ever since. First, they buried it under one shield, then under a second, far larger one. They cannot move it. They cannot break it apart. They cannot make it safe. All they can do is seal it away and wait and measure. It has a name too: corium. Corium is not spent fuel. It is not waste in a barrel. It is what a reactor becomes when its core grows hot enough to melt itself and everything around it. The uranium fuel, the metal that held it, the steel, the sand, the concrete it burned into, all of it fused into a single new material that did not exist the day before. In the history of nuclear power, this has formed only 5 times, once at 3 Mile Island, once here, and 3 times at Fukushima. And to understand how the core of a reactor can melt and move and harden into a thing no one can go near, you have to go back to the night of the 26th of April, 1986. Deep inside the ruined reactor, what was left of the core was still hot enough to melt steel, more than 2,000 degrees. From the air, crews dropped sand and boron onto the burning core, trying to smother it, and below, it all melted into a single molten mass. And the mass began to move, down. It flowed through pipes, through cracks in the floor, burning down through more than 2 meters of concrete, sinking level by level into the dark beneath the reactor. As it sank, engineers feared it would reach the water pooled in the rooms below and set off a second explosion. Men were sent down into the dark to drain that water by hand. The melt never reached it. Somewhere in a corridor far below reactor number 4, it slowed and cooled and hardened into the shape we know today. And there it stayed, too hot, too radioactive for anyone to come near. For months, no one knew exactly where it had stopped or what it had become. And then, a small team was sent down to find it. It was December, 8 months after the explosion. The fires were out, the reactor was silent, and small teams of men began to push into the ruins beneath it. They moved through flooded corridors, in the dark, carrying dosimeters that spiked the instant they switched them on. They were looking for the core, for what was left of it. And in a corridor deep below reactor number 4, they found it, a black, glassy mass, hardened against the concrete, exactly where it had stopped. The men measured the radiation pouring off its surface, around 8,000 roentgens an hour, a dose that kills in minutes. They could not stay. They could barely photograph it. When they tried, the radiation struck the camera itself, burning white specks and streaks across every frame. Over the years that followed, the radiation slowly fell, not because anyone made it safe. The isotopes simply decayed, and by the middle of the 1990s, it had dropped just enough that a person could step into that room for a few minutes. In 1996, one man did. His name was Artur Korniev, a radiation specialist who had spent a decade hunting the lost fuel through the ruins of the plant. Years later, the exposure clouded his eyes with cataracts, but he had done what almost no one else would. He had looked at it and recorded what he saw. By now they knew what the object was and where it was. The only question left was what to do with it, and slowly they understood the answer. There was nothing they could do. The obvious thing would be to remove it, to take this object apart and carry it somewhere safe, but every way of getting rid of it makes things worse. You cannot lift it out. It is fused into the floors of the building, part of the structure now. You cannot cut it apart. To approach it long enough to try would be fatal, and the object is harder than the concrete around it. When scientists needed a sample to study, they could not drill into it. In the end, they shot it with a rifle, and a small piece broke away. But breaking it carries its own danger. As it ages, parts of the elephant's foot are slowly turning to dust, and that dust, if it escapes, can be breathed in. So you cannot move it. You cannot break it. You cannot bury it without releasing it. There was only ever one option left: wall it off. In the months after the disaster, an army of workers called liquidators raced to build a shelter over the reactor. A vast shell of steel and concrete, thrown up in just over half a year, by men who could work only seconds at a time before they had to run. They called it the sarcophagus, but it had been built too fast. Within a few years, it began to crack and leak. So the world built a second one. In 2016, engineers assembled an enormous steel arch beside the reactor and slid it into place over the entire ruin. It is the largest movable structure ever built on land. It is designed to hold for 100 years. Since the new shield went up, the instruments sealed inside with it have started to record something no one expected. For 40 years, the world has treated this object as something to be contained, sealed away, watched, waited out, but it has never been still. Since the new shield closed over the reactor, sensors in one sealed room have picked up a faint signal. The number of neutrons coming off the fuel is slowly rising, and neutrons are the signature of nuclear fission. Deep inside the mass, the reaction that created it never fully stopped. As the ruin slowly dried out beneath the shield, the fuel began, very slowly, to react again. It is not an explosion. It is not another meltdown. It is a slow climb that scientists are still watching and may one day have to reach in and stop.